October 14, 1943. The sky over Germany looked empty from a distance, but inside a B-17 flying at 25,000 feet, it felt crowded with noise, vibration, and fear. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano was wedged into the tail section of the bomber, his body folded into a space so tight it barely seemed built for a man. The metal around him was ice cold. His oxygen mask pressed against his face. Every breath felt thin. Every sound came through the airframe as a shudder, a groan, or a sharp metallic rattle. His hands were wrapped around twin .50 caliber machine guns, weapons so heavy they felt like anchors attached to his shoulders. He shifted slightly on the narrow support beneath him and tried to ignore the ache already building in his arms. The bomber held its line in formation, moving steadily toward the target. Then he saw it. A German fighter. It appeared low and behind, exactly where every tail gunner dreaded seeing one. A Focke-Wulf 190, small and vicious-looking, angling in with terrifying confidence. Romano leaned toward his sight, trying to force calm into his breathing. He had only a simple ring and bead set up to work with, a primitive aiming system that gave him almost nothing. No calculation. No correction. No help. He had to judge speed, distance, and lead on instinct alone while both aircraft tore through the sky at a combined speed so fast there was barely time to think. He fired. The guns thundered. Traces streaked out into the freezing air. For one split second he wanted to believe they were true. Then he saw the rounds pass harmlessly behind the fighter. He had missed. Again. The FW-190 did not miss. Its cannons flashed, and a burst of 20mm shells slammed into the rear of the bomber. Aluminum split open like thin sheet metal. The entire tail section shook so violently Romano felt it in his teeth. Fragments snapped past him. For a moment the tail seemed to become all noise and sparks and raw terror. That same scene was unfolding again and again all across the sky that day. Tail gunners seeing enemy fighters too late. Firing too wide. German pilots pressing the attack because they knew the return fire was usually inaccurate. American bombers taking punishment they could not afford. Men dying in aircraft that had been advertised as flying fortresses. This was the second Schweinfurt raid, one of the hardest blows the 8th Air Force had taken so far. Nearly 300 B-17s had been sent deep into Germany without fighter escort. By the time the day ended, dozens would be gone from the sky forever. More would limp home ruined beyond repair. Hundreds of airmen would never come back at all. The losses were so severe that even the men who survived understood something had broken. This could not continue. Not like this. After the mission, the numbers told the story with a cruelty no speech could soften. Tail gunners, supposedly the last shield protecting the bomber's most vulnerable angle, were hitting enemy fighters at rates so low they barely changed the outcome of an attack. German pilots had learned the weakness. Come in from the rear. Absorb a few seconds of scattered fire. Get close. Destroy the bomber. Repeat. The theory behind the B-17 had been confidence made metal. Enough machine guns, enough overlapping fire, and the formation would defend itself. On paper it sounded unbeatable. In the air over Germany, reality tore through it one cannon burst at a time. Michael Romano had arrived in England only a short time earlier. He was young, smaller than many of the men around him, and not the sort of person anyone would have pointed to as a future innovator. He was from Pittsburgh, the son of a working family, and he had left school early to work during hard times. Steel mills and machinery had taught him how things wore down, how metal failed, how practical men solved problems because no one else was going to solve them for them. But he had no engineering title, no college training, no authority. The Army Air Forces had not chosen him for brilliance. They had chosen him because he was small enough to fit in the tail. Training had not prepared him for what combat really was. On the ground, under controlled conditions, gunnery looked difficult but manageable. In the air it became something else entirely. The tail section was cramped and freezing. Gloves made fine movement clumsy. The guns had to be wrestled into position with force and timing. The sight gave almost no useful aid against a diving fighter moving at extreme speed. Every engagement became a gamble. Estimate wrong by a fraction and the tracers slipped behind the target. Estimate late and the enemy's cannons opened first. Romano flew mission after mission and began to feel the same frustration harden inside him. He would fire hundreds of rounds. He would think he had gotten close. Then the film would say otherwise. No hits. No meaningful effect. Fighters still broke through. Bombers still burned. Men still vanished from formation. After one mission, he remained on the hard stand long after the rest of the crew had gone. The aircraft still smelled of cordite, hot oil, and hydraulic fluid. The tail section was scarred from battle. Romano climbed back into his position and looked at the crude sight in front of him. He stared through the plexiglass, not at the sky now, but at the problem itself. He thought about what happened in combat, about how quickly a fighter appeared, about how little time he had, about how blind he felt once the firing started. The more he thought, the clearer it became. The problem was not simply that the guns were heavy or the position was cramped. The deeper problem was that he had no reliable visual feedback. He was trying to predict a moving solution in empty space without being able to confirm, in real time, where his fire was truly going. He was guessing first and learning too late. Then he noticed something strange and simple in the curved plexiglass. A distorted reflection. Not useful as it was, but enough to make his mind jump. Reflection meant angle. Angle meant visibility. Visibility meant information. And information, in a fight measured in seconds, could mean survival. He pulled out his logbook and began to sketch. At first the idea was rough. Mirrors. Small ones. Positioned where they could show him more than the narrow straight-ahead view his current sight allowed. Then another thought followed. A reflector sight, not the crude ring and bead arrangement he hated, but something closer to what fighter pilots used, a floating aiming reference he could track naturally. Not a complex computing gun sight. Nothing fancy. Just a better way to see the target and a better way to understand his own gun alignment at the same time. He kept drawing. Angles. Brackets. Sight lines. He measured the cramped geometry around him as best he could. He imagined where mirrors could be mounted without blocking movement. He imagined how a reflector sight might sit in the tail despite the lack of room. The more he worked, the less impossible it looked. But impossible was not the same as permitted. He knew perfectly well that an authorized modification of defensive armament was against regulations. Aircraft were not to be casually altered by enlisted men with field ideas and scrap parts. The Army had procedures. Orders. Technical standards. Approval chains. Men above his rank decided what could be installed, tested, and trusted. Romano also knew those approved systems were getting people killed. That night, the choice settled inside him quietly. Not like rebellion. Not like heroism. More like a practical conclusion. If the official answer was to wait while crews kept dying, then waiting was no answer at all. He needed help, and he found it where practical soldiers often found it, in the men who could make broken things work. The base sheet metal shop was full of mechanics and technicians who understood machines better than many officers understood paperwork. Among them was a technical sergeant named Frank Kellerman, older than Romano, harder around the edges, and experienced enough to recognize two things immediately when Romano showed him the sketches: first, that the idea was unauthorized; second, that it might actually work. Kellerman studied the drawings in silence for a few minutes. He asked a handful of questions, the kind that mattered. Where would the brackets sit? How much vibration could the setup tolerate? What kind of sight had Romano imagined? Could they scavenge components rather than build everything from nothing? Romano answered as best he could. Kellerman finally looked up and said the obvious. This could get both of them into serious trouble. Romano knew. Kellerman asked when the next mission was. When Romano told him, Kellerman gave a short nod that sounded almost like resignation. Then he said they had better move fast. That night, while much of the airfield slept, the two men began building something the army had not asked for and had not approved. They worked in a corner of the maintenance area under weak light, surrounded by scrap material, damaged parts, and the smell of oil and metal filings. It was not a laboratory. It was not a design bureau. It was a wartime workshop, the kind of place where men built what they needed because neat official solutions were always late. They scavenged what they could. Curved mirrors from damaged equipment. Plexiglass from broken aircraft sections. Aluminum pieces that could be cut, bent, and turned into brackets. Most important of all, they found a usable reflector sight from a wrecked fighter. It was not made for a B-17 tail position. That did not matter. Kellerman reworked the mounting idea by hand, adjusting it for the cramped space Romano had to live and fight in. The mirrors were harder. Too large, and they would obstruct movement. Too small, and they would be useless. The angle had to be right, not for elegance, but for function. Romano needed to glimpse tracer alignment and barrel relationship without taking his whole attention off the target. They kept adjusting, mounting, removing, changing, testing lines of view again and again until the layout began to make sense. By the darkest hours before dawn, the rough system finally existed. It looked improvised because it was improvised. The brackets were practical, not pretty. The mounting would have made a factory engineer wince. Nothing about it had passed through official channels. Nothing about it had been signed off. If the wrong officer saw it first, the whole thing would likely be torn out before Romano ever got to test it. But when he climbed into the tail and looked through it, the difference hit him immediately. For the first time, he did not feel blind. Send part 2 and I'll continue from the first combat test onward in the same style. Dawn came fast, and with it, the kind of cold that cut straight through gloves, leather, and bone. The airfield stirred to life as crews moved around the bombers, checking engines, loading ammunition, preparing for another mission into hostile skies. Nothing about the morning hinted that anything had changed. Romano kept quiet. He didn't mention the modification. He didn't explain what he and Kellerman had built. He just climbed back into the tail section like every other day, except this time, something was different. The improvised sight sat in front of him, crude, unofficial, and completely against regulations. But it felt right. As the engines roared to full power and the bomber lifted off the runway, Romano kept stealing small glances at the setup, adjusting his position, getting used to the new angles. The reflector sight floated faintly in his view, a simple aiming reference. The mirrors, positioned just outside his direct line of sight, gave him a strange but powerful sense of awareness. He could see more. Not everything, but more than before. It wasn't perfect. But it was something. And something was better than blind. Hours later, deep over enemy territory, the formation tightened. The sky began to fill with flak bursts, dark explosions blooming around the bombers like deadly clouds. The aircraft shook as shockwaves passed through it. Romano gripped his guns tighter. Then came the fighters. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 approached from behind, low and fast, exactly like the others had before. Same angle. Same confidence. The kind of attack that had worked dozens of times already. Romano moved his guns into position. For a brief second, instinct told him to aim the old way, to guess, to lead based on feel. But this time, he forced himself to trust the new system. He centered the reflector reticle on the incoming fighter. At the same time, in the edge of his vision, the mirrors showed him something he had never truly seen before, the alignment of his guns relative to the target. Not perfect, but enough to understand where his rounds would go. He fired. The guns roared. Tracers streamed outward. In the mirrors, he saw the truth instantly. Too far behind. For the first time in combat, he didn't have to guess why he missed. He could see it. He adjusted. Just slightly ahead of the target. Fired again. This time, the tracers and the fighter began to line up. Another short burst. And then it happened. The German aircraft jerked violently. Smoke burst from the engine. The fighter rolled, lost control, and spiraled downward. Romano froze for a second, staring through the glass. He had hit it. Not by luck. Not by guessing. He had corrected his fire in real time. It worked. The realization hit him like a shock. Everything he had struggled with, every missed shot, every failed attempt, suddenly made sense. The system wasn't magic. It didn't make him a better gunner overnight. It simply gave him what he had been missing all along. Feedback. Understanding. Control. For the rest of the mission, he stayed focused, watching every burst, adjusting, learning faster than he ever had before. When the bomber finally turned for home and landed hours later, Romano climbed out of the aircraft with something he had never carried before. Proof. But the moment didn't last long. During routine inspection, the crew chief spotted it immediately. The mirrors. The bracket. The sight that didn't belong there. Within minutes, the issue moved up the chain of command. Officers arrived, expressions hard, voices sharp. Romano stood beside the aircraft as questions came fast and direct. What was this? Who authorized it? Why had it been installed? He answered honestly. He had built it. He had installed it. He believed it would work. That last part did not help. The armament officer was furious. Regulations existed for a reason. Aircraft weren't experiments. Unauthorized changes could cause failure, interference, even catastrophe. It didn't matter that Romano claimed success. One mission didn't prove anything. The order was simple. Remove it. Immediately. For a moment, it looked like that was the end of it. The system would be taken out, the idea buried, and Romano likely punished for stepping outside his role. But something unexpected happened. Other crew members spoke up. The pilot mentioned the engagement. Others had seen the fighter go down. Word had already started spreading across the group. A tail gunner had scored a clean hit from the exact angle that usually failed. That got attention. Not from everyone, some officers remained focused on discipline and procedure, but enough to create doubt. Enough to pause the immediate removal. The discussion escalated quickly. What had started as a violation became a question. What if it worked? By evening, the issue had reached the group commander. Unlike the others, he didn't react with immediate anger. He listened. He asked for details. He looked at the numbers, the losses, the hit rates, the growing pattern of failure. Then he made a decision. The system would stay. Not because it was approved. Not because it was safe. But because the current situation was worse. Romano was ordered to fly again with the modifications still installed. Gun cameras would record everything. The next missions would decide whether this was a dangerous mistake or something worth keeping. The pressure shifted instantly. Now it wasn't just Romano's idea on the line. It was his proof. The following mission came quickly. Back into the sky. Back into formation. Back into danger. This time, Romano was ready. When the fighters came, and they always came, he tracked them through the reflector sight, using the mirrors to guide his adjustments. Burst after burst, he corrected faster, tighter, more accurately than ever before. And this time, it wasn't just one engagement. Multiple attacks. Multiple hits. Gun camera footage captured everything, the traces, the adjustments, the impact points. There was no arguing with it. No guessing. No interpretation. The difference was clear. Romano was using far less ammunition per engagement. And getting real results. When the aircraft landed and the footage was reviewed, even the officers who had opposed the idea couldn't ignore it anymore. The system worked. Not perfectly. Not flawlessly. But dramatically better than what they had. And in a war where small improvements meant survival, that was enough. What followed wasn't a formal program. There were no polished reports or immediate approvals from higher command. Instead, it began the way many wartime innovations did, quietly, urgently, and with whatever resources were available. Kellerman went back to the shop. More parts were gathered. More units were built. One aircraft became two. Two became several. Word spread faster than any official order could. Tail gunners started asking for it. Not because it looked impressive, but because it gave them a fighting chance. Within days, more bombers carried versions of the same idea, slightly different builds, slightly different adjustments, but the same core concept Romano had sketched in his logbook. A way to see. A way to correct. A way to survive. And for the first time in months, something began to change in the sky. The change didn't happen overnight, but the difference was impossible to ignore. At first, it showed up in small ways. Gunners who used to fire long, desperate bursts were now shooting in shorter, controlled bursts. They weren't guessing anymore. They were watching, adjusting, correcting. Instead of spraying thousands of rounds into empty sky, they were walking their fire onto real targets. Then the reports started coming in. Enemy fighters breaking off attacks earlier than before. German pilots hesitating instead of committing fully. More aircraft returning without damage from the rear. And then came the numbers. On one mission, gunners equipped with the improvised sight systems engaged dozens of incoming fighters and shot down more than anyone expected. Not one or two lucky hits. Consistent results. Multiple confirmed kills from the same positions that had previously struggled to land even a single effective shot. The hit rate had changed. Dramatically. What had once been around 6 to 8% was now climbing past 20% in some engagements. It wasn't perfect. It didn't make the bombers invincible. But it changed the equation. For the first time, attacking from the rear was no longer safe. German pilots noticed immediately. Their after-action reports began to reflect the shift. Where tail guns had once been described as weak and predictable, they were now being called dangerous. Not because the guns had changed, but because the men behind them could finally use them properly. That forced a reaction. Fighter tactics began to evolve. Instead of approaching from directly behind, pilots started trying different angles, faster passes, head-on attacks, riskier approaches that exposed them to other defensive guns. It didn't eliminate the threat, but it made every engagement harder, more dangerous, more uncertain. And in war, uncertainty is everything. Back at the base, what had started as a quiet, unofficial modification had turned into something much bigger. Kellerman and the maintenance crew worked non-stop. Scrap parts became components. Damaged aircraft became supply sources. Reflector sights were pulled from wrecked fighters. Mirrors were cut, shaped, and mounted by hand. There was no formal production line, just urgency and necessity driving every step. They built as many units as they could, as fast as they could. For a day. Sometimes more. Each one slightly different, but all based on the same idea Romano had drawn in his logbook. Aircraft after aircraft received the system. Tail gunners who had never met Romano were now flying with his idea. Some of them didn't even know his name. They just knew the difference it made. Eventually, the results reached higher command. This time, the reaction was different. Instead of anger, there was interest. Instead of orders to remove, there were questions. Officers came to inspect the system personally. They examined the setup, watched gun camera footage, and listened to reports from crews who had used it in combat. What they saw was not a perfect solution, but it was something they desperately needed. Something that worked. Authorization followed, not in the clean, formal way regulations preferred, but fast enough to matter. The system was approved for wider use. What had once been unauthorized became field expedient. What had been against regulations became recommended. And just like that, the idea spread beyond a single group. More bombers. More crews. More missions. By late 1943, variations of the mirror-assisted sight system were appearing across multiple units. The concept had proven itself in the only place that mattered, combat. Even the engineers took notice. At Boeing, where more advanced tail turret designs were already in development, elements of Romano's approach began influencing official designs. The idea of combining better visual tracking with improved aiming references was no longer dismissed. It was studied, refined, and eventually built into production systems. The difference showed in the statistics. Bomber groups equipped with improved tail sighting systems began suffering fewer losses from rear attacks. Not eliminated, but reduced enough to matter. Enough to keep crews alive who otherwise would not have made it home. Hundreds of aircraft. Thousands of men. Survival, in war, is never guaranteed. But sometimes, it shifts just enough to change everything. Romano kept flying. Mission after mission. He didn't become famous. He didn't suddenly stand out in briefings or reports. He just kept doing his job, now with a system he trusted. Over time, his own record improved. More hits. More successful engagements. Not because he had changed as a person, but because he finally had the tools to match the reality he was facing. Then, during one mission over heavily defended territory, everything went wrong. Flak bursts surrounded the formation, closer and more intense than usual. One explosion tore through Romano's aircraft, sending fragments ripping through the tail section. Systems failed. Fuel leaked. Hydraulic lines ruptured. Still, he stayed at his position. Even as the aircraft struggled, even as damage spread, he continued firing at incoming fighters, holding them off as long as he could. The bomber didn't make it back clean. It crash-landed after crossing into safer territory. The crew survived, barely. Romano's war changed after that. He spent the remaining months as a prisoner, far from the skies where he had fought and adapted and survived. When the war finally ended, he returned home. Lighter. Quieter. Different. There was no parade waiting for him. No public recognition of what he had done. His contribution was recorded, acknowledged in official language, but not celebrated the way stories often are. He went back to a normal life. Work. Family. Routine. When asked about the war, he didn't talk much. If he mentioned anything, it was simple. Practical. The kind of answer a man gives when he doesn't see himself as extraordinary. He had just fixed a problem. That's how he saw it. But the impact remained. The systems that followed, improved turrets, better sights, more advanced tracking, all carried the same core idea forward. Give the gunner a clearer picture. Let him understand his aim. Let him adjust in real time. What began as mirrors and salvaged parts became standard thinking. Years later, at a reunion, another former gunner approached him. Not with technical questions. Not with analysis. Just with gratitude. Because of that idea. Because of that decision to act instead of wait. He had survived. His life, his family, everything that came after, existed because someone refused to accept that the system couldn't be changed. Romano didn't respond with a speech. He didn't take credit. He simply shrugged, the same way he always had, and gave the kind of answer only someone like him would give. Anyone else would have done it. But that wasn't true. Thousands of gunners faced the same problem. The same broken system. The same impossible odds. Only one chose to do something about it. And that's the part history almost forgets. Not the invention. Not the numbers. But the moment where someone looked at failure and refused to accept it. Because sometimes, the most important change doesn't come from orders. It comes from a single decision made quietly, without permission, in the middle of a war where waiting meant dying. And that decision can echo far beyond the man who made it.